Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Peter Walton and Mike Branagan-Harris, and we're here to talk about everything to do with medical device registries. So what they are, how they're different to clinical trials, and how you can really implement them in your marketing strategy moving forwards. So welcome to both of you today.
Thank you.
And Dr. Peter Walton, can I start with you, please? Please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So I'm Peter Walton, the Managing Director of Dendrite Clinical Systems, and I've been in the data management game for 30 years. So while I started life as a clinician, I jumped ship, did an MBA, and learned that quality organizations track outcomes. And that was my inspiration for setting up Dendrite. And we've now set up over 200 registries around the world across a multitude of specialties.
Wow. And so you were actually a medical doctor to start off with as well?
Correct. So I'm a Cambridge Thomas's graduate, and I spent a few years in obstetrics.
Fantastic. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Claudia. Great to be back here, and great to have Peter here as well. So I'm Mike Branagan-Harris, the original founder and CEO of Device Access. A few weeks ago, Device Access was bought, and I'm now an independent consultant and working with all those great people I've worked with in the past. Of course, you, Claudia, and Peter. So I'm helping companies through my network of experts, yourselves included, about getting great tech to patients faster, but also with my new role in my new business of health tech strategies, I'm really passionate about patients getting these new technologies faster, and helping to lobby governments and other bodies to try and break down the barriers, particularly regulatory barriers. We know that recently it's become more difficult to bring products to the UK and Europe. So helping to work, raise awareness of patients and charities. And so, all this is part of the story of getting great tech to patients faster.
And it is the great tech to patients faster. And also, how do we not justify, but show that it's great tech as well? So let's start right back at the basics. So when we talk about what is a registry, many of our listeners might know what a registry is, or they've seen it in certain instances. But Peter, can I come to you first?
Sure thing.
When somebody says, what is a registry, how would you describe a registry?
Well, a registry is very simply a collection of data on a defined patient population, or it might be for a defined medical device, ideally all consecutive cases, and ideally longitudinal. So you're collecting data into a database that you can then analyze.
So it's got all of the patients that are completed, say, within a hospital, and so that you have no breaks in that data at all.
Exactly. So the very first one I set up was the UK Heart Valve Registry that collected data on all heart valves implanted across the UK. And they had something like 100,000 patient years of data that enabled them to produce unbelievable clinical science. So they published, at one point they were publishing a high quality research article into a high quality journal every month, Heart, Circulation, New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, and so on. So it's very powerful in terms of the output you can generate.
And so when we look at registries, and Mike, I'll come to you in a little bit as well, but when we look at registries, what is the main difference between a registry and a clinical trial?
A registry is complementary to a clinical trial. With a clinical trial, you have well-defined inclusion-exclusion criteria. With a registry, it's collecting data on everybody. So it's true real-world data collection.
What would be the main benefits over one to the other? Because for me, I've grown up in med tech.
Yep.
For the last 25 years, and it was always randomized controlled trials are really, really important. And, that's how you get your regulatory approval. So where do registries fit in? Because I see that, you get the data over a longitudinal time path and you get a larger amount of data. But how does that fit in with clinical trials? Because you say they work alongside them.
I believe that a clinical trial will tell you a proper answer, whereas a registry is, if you like, a hypothesis generator. It'll tell you where to look. And it's only when you accumulate large volumes that you suddenly discover, my goodness, that's a good place to do a clinical trial, and that one isn't.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's almost like an open, sort of an open plan clinical trial. As in, when you start looking at clinical data for a device, you first do it with a very sort of broad range, so that you start seeing what the data looks like. And you're almost saying registries are really helpful for that perspective as well.
Exactly. You see expected differences and similarities, and then you see unexpected similarities and differences, which then drives the question of why.
So how much data can you collect in a registry? And what I mean by that is you're saying you're going to start seeing things that you never thought you knew about before. So when I have a clinical trial, I have my inclusion criteria and I have my exclusion criteria, and I also have my primary outcomes and my secondary outcomes, and those are the measures I'm going to collect against. When you do a registry, what's the limitations of what you can collect?
Well, there are really no limitations apart from the practicality aspect of how difficult it is to collect that data. So sometimes people over-engineer a registry with hundreds of questions, and then it's impossible to find the time to complete that. So it's about getting the balance right. You need enough to be able to, if you like, describe the patient population, delineate different patient groups, then look at sort of process and outcomes. And one of the beauties of registries, unlike clinical trials, is you can get the patient to help out here. So registries can collect data with the doctor keying in information, but then we've set up multiple registries where the registry will ping out a message to a patient's smartphone. They go tap, 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 filling in a questionnaire, wherever the patient is on the planet, and the data goes back in the registry. And so we've just set up launched a new registry for the British Hernia Society, and there are about 100,000 hernia operations done every year in the UK. They are planning to collect 10-year outcome data on these patients through this mechanism.
Wow. That's amazing, actually, because half the problem with clinical trials is that you can't get patients back and you get really big fall-off rates. But actually with the registries then, you can actually ping this information out or ping the request out wherever they are and get that back.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I think it's a really good thing. And you think about everything in life now, if you go and buy something from a shop and they want to know how you got on with it. So why, if you think about why we're doing all this clinical research, and it's all about reducing uncertainty with commissioners and payers. But commissioners and payers listen to patients. And when you think about bringing technology into the UK, it's about primarily new treatments, and I've done so many of them over the last 15 years, running device access, over 50 products through NICE, but a lot of those were new therapies. And so when you go to NICE in the old days, they wanted to know, is it safe and does it work? And and being able to collect that data over the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 6 years, and exactly what Peter's talking about, it serves so many purposes. It gives assurances to payers and providers that they're funding the right things, that patients are happy, they're safe. What they don't want is a repeat of the metal on metal and the vaginal meshes and the breast implants. And if there'd been an appropriate registry in place and those patients were able to alert different bodies that they weren't getting on well, we wouldn't have the regulatory nightmare.
So that's
that
really
we've got
interesting.
now.
So at the moment we have post-market surveillance, which isn't ongoing. It's for a set amount of time, really, isn't it? So how are you seeing that's impacting registries at the moment? Because as you're saying, Mike, it almost feels like an obligation to companies, but also a real benefit. Because if you are running these long-term registries, you can really justify everything that you're saying at the beginning and show the true value to medtech or to the healthcare providers. And if you can do that, surely you're above other companies in that area as well.
Exactly right. And it's very evident to me that the other beautiful benefit of a registry for a medical device company is you're changing the dynamic. You're not just providing a bit of kit. You're demonstrating your commitment to quality and understanding that as time rolls on, you'll see that the registry can help guide patient selection. It can provide in better informed consent on outcomes. It can help with working out learning curves, because for some medical device implantation, they're technically quite difficult. And different doctors, different clinicians learn at different speeds.
And actually, from a marketing perspective, that's fantastic, because if you see that, you implement this one thing and you see a reduction in the learning curve in a certain set of hospitals,
Exactly right.
and actually then, but you don't see it in the others, that's hugely powerful, because now you know you need to roll that out. So as a test base, it's fantastic to get better outcomes for patients too.
And some companies have said to me, oh, I'm worried that the outcomes may not give me what I'm expecting to see. In truth, even poor outcomes can be fantastic information for those companies because it allows you then to make a decision. Am I in the right marketplace? Do I pull out? Do I redesign the product? Or am I not guiding the clinicians in terms of education and training how best to use this?
We had this exact same comment when we were talking in the Regulatory podcast, and also in the market research, because both of them said actually sometimes if you get the wrong information back, it's the best thing you can have because then you know to make an adjustment, which is exactly the same here, and I can see how that's a concern. Well, what if I don't get the outcomes I want? But it gives everybody information, doesn't it? And so then you know what the next step is rather than blindly moving forward. How does this compare from a cost perspective to a clinical trial? Because of course budgets are a concern when it comes to medtech as well. So how does it compare on a cost?
I think that's something that often surprises medtech companies, that actually setting up a registry is a fraction of the cost of running a clinical trial. So the typical cost is somewhere between £50,000 and £100,000 set up, depending upon the complexity of the registry, whether you want multiple servers because you're meeting GDPR needs across the world, whether you want to run it in multiple languages, and so on. So that's the sort of feel. But whereas a clinical trial can cost you hundreds of thousands or millions.
So that people know, what are the factors that affect the cost of a registry? So I'm sure they don't all cost £100,000. Like, what's the varying factors? And also, what could somebody expect from year 2, 3 onwards? How does that look? Just so that people understand what it looks like.
So firstly, it's the complexity of the registry. So if I go back to that example of the stent, the venous stent registry, a patient may come in, be assessed, may be admitted more than once. During that admission, may have more than one operation. During that operation, they may have more than one vein segment treated. And for each vein segment, they may have more than one stent inserted. So it's not a simple database that you can build in Access or Excel. You need to be able to build child of child of child tables. So it's complex underlying data structure, number one. Secondly, with different countries, there are different legal environments for data protection. So we have servers in the US to meet the HIPAA requirements for the US. We have servers in the EU, within the NHS net, sitting in various government departments. So the Kuwaitis have their own rules. We have to use a server in Kuwait and so on. Then you might want to have special features. So sometimes we build an interactive diagram, so you can click on a diagram of a body anatomy and it'll answer, it'll give you a coded answer, or vice versa. Then multiple languages is the real challenge. So we built, the biggest one we had involved 17 different languages, including tricky ones like Chinese, Russian, Korean, Thai, Arabic, and dealing with Cyrillic and non-Cyrillic alphabets can be challenging. So we can do all of that within one package.
So the startup and the varying factors, so it's clear what the varying factors are, or all these different things that can change the cost. So once you've had it set up and you're running and it's all good and you've captured your first patient and you're now moving forwards, what's the ongoing cost of running the registry?
Typically, it's about 20 to 22% of the initial capital charge per year. And that covers a number of things. It covers a registration help desk, so that as people come on to use your system, we can provide a service to get people registered that are authorized to use the database.
Yeah.
When I say that, it's because we've had people from the Daily Mail try to log in. So you have to have mechanisms in place to screen those out. There's always software maintenance because you need to upgrade software, and there's data maintenance if there's a problem with the data. So we provide that service. Then there's secure hosting. So it's these registries sit in a cloud somewhere, and that has a cost along with all the security settings.
But actually to collect all your patients' data forever, ongoing, and at maybe like, you say 20 to 21% or something like that of the start cost, that doesn't seem a high cost. to collect that amount of data.
Well,
I think I would have thought it'd be higher.
Well, when you look at the value of it.
Maybe I should be charging more.
I mean, you look at the value of that. Everything is like Trustpilot or Google reviews, isn't it? It's like, and it happens in everything else out there. So why shouldn't it happen more? I truly believe these mechanisms of capturing patient outcomes should be used so much more, and it should help to accelerate the real value of these. We've talked about this before, that, through medical technologies and minimally invasive surgery and the sort of things that we've worked with over the years, all of us around this table, they've enabled patients to be treated, to revolutionize their recovery, getting them out of hospital faster or back to work faster, which is great for everyone, to reduce length of stay, to reduce operating theatre time. By collecting that information, it goes back to, when we were talking to John on the podcast a few weeks ago, hospitals are more and more having to justify what they're spending their money on. And if that company is showing that their technology is better than the others, or they're committed to quality outcomes, that is great for everyone. It's great for the industry that these things are making a difference to patients' lives, and they're affordable and they're safe.
I think it's the data behind it.
And some of these patient groups are very expensive to treat. So we set up something called BADGEAR, the UK National Bone and Joint Infection Registry. And some of these patients will grumble on for 20, 30 years, having devices taken out and put back in and treated at specialist centres. They can be very expensive and also have huge morbidity. So with the central registry, they're able to track which devices have fewer problems, which antibiotics give you the best results, which centres are giving the best results. So it's become an incredibly powerful registry that's going to save morbidity and reduce cost.
It's fantastic to see the unintended outcomes that you didn't realise were there.
Well, there's always an intention.
When I say unintended, what I mean is because you're collecting so much data, I think I didn't phrase that very well. Because you're collecting so much data, you can actually see everything, which means, you can actually then see where the real benefits are.
Exactly
and
right.
focus in on them, and then, keep moving forward that way.
Exactly right.
And the thing about a clinical trial is you publish it and that's it. The great thing, particularly I'm a big fan of EPROMs, and I've seen it work and with technologies in urology, for example. But what it becomes, though, is the engine of publications for companies. So when they go to their annual vascular meetings or cardiology meetings, they can share their 4-year results, their 5-year results, their 6-year results, and it becomes a talking point. Look, not only we care as a company about the outcomes, and here's how good patients are getting on with it, and it becomes a very simple, credible mechanism for publishing proper independent evidence that's independent of the company, and it gives these companies huge credibility.
That's actually what I was also going to ask. So who tends to run the registries? I mean, how does it work from a registry perspective? So, it's obviously has huge benefits to the companies because they can see what's happening with their device, they can make changes, things like that. But who actually normally funds the registries? What's the best practice for that, would you say?
I think for medical devices, the best place to put the registry is with a specialist surgical or medical or interventional society, because that's the most credible location. If the registry sits under the company, the results that come out aren't necessarily believed as much as they are when it comes
even though they
from
may be trustworthy.
Exactly.
They're not believed as much. Yeah,
it has to be independent, and I think that's where particularly NICE are interested in NICE compliant registers, as they call them. But we were talking earlier, I've had too many I told you so stories with companies that have brought new treatments into the UK. One fairly recently, won't mention a name, and I've had another I told you so because they decided to use a doctor to do the registry. And doctors, we were talking about this earlier, weren't we, Peter, about just how busy doctors are and how few people they have working with them now, and you can elaborate on that.
You mean a doctor run a registry versus a company like Dendrite to run the registry?
They said they'd run it, and they've got this such a great KOL that, oh no, we were giving them 30k to do this. Well, I've had too many experiences at NICE in meetings where the chair has phoned up this head of society, this chief professor of whatever, and they haven't started it, or it hasn't been published, or it's not constructed in the right way. And it's no surprise that the people that medtech knock on the doors of these clinicians are getting busier and busier and busier, and they're focusing on the clinical work and not this other stuff that they're sort of brought into doing, but they don't have time to do it. Explain that the meeting you had recently at a meeting where you were saying about the doctors just don't have the staff anymore.
Well, I think that's one of the problems of doctors now working in big teaching hospitals where they're forced to use an electronic patient record system. It's actually slowing down the amount of time they can spend with patients
Because they're completing it all the time.
because they're just overwhelmed with having to use these EPR systems.
So I think one thing that we spoke about before, and actually is really important when it comes to who's running the registry as well, is actually understanding what outcome you're looking for. And so from a marketing perspective, and I really want to talk about this, what are the benefits to marketers of running registries? And we've sort of touched on it a little bit already, but I think, we spoke earlier about, are you looking to apply to NICE? Are you looking to boost your claims? What are you looking to do? What do you feel are the main benefits for marketers when it comes, apart from the educational materials and things like that? I think that's a clear one of if you're not getting, the outcomes you want, how can you address it there? But what else do you think there are?
I think the main benefit, and this may be a surprise, is it changes the dynamic of the relationship between the company and the clinicians.
What do you mean by that?
Instead of here I am providing you with a bit of kit, I'm providing you not just with a device, but also the means to track the outcome. So you become a collaborator rather than a supplier. And as Mike was saying, there's always something new to talk about. Discovering that this device works in that patient group better than that patient group. So it enables the sales team and the marketing team to get much closer to their end customer and understand where things are going well and where things are problematic.
I think it's about quality control, right? So doctors want to be the best at what they do, and they don't want to be, there's so much public information now, even on the NHS websites. So doctors want to be the best at what they do. The medical device industry wants to have that relationship for as long as possible because competition comes, particularly with legacy products. And so what it gives the doctor is that assurance that these outcomes are good and that patients are getting on really well and they're doing the right thing and they're not going to be in front of the courts, so doing the wrong things, or that they are committed to quality outcomes like we do with everything in normal life. Like I say, it's you buy a car on there emailing you, how was your service, how are you getting on, it's normal stuff, but it doesn't happen as much as it should do in medical device world. And anything that the industry does to help to continue to bring these great technologies into patients' lives is so important. We're talking earlier about physician deficit. So take dermatology. In the United States, there's going to be a 30% increase of skin cancer over the next, up to 2030. But there's a 23% reduction in physicians. So what is there out there that can sort that out? Well, it's medical technologies. And so it's building that whole story around why a technology should be introduced, why it's making a difference to patients' lives, but also the benefits are around ensuring that not only providers of care, the hospitals, are doing the right thing, but also that the payers of care are funding the right technologies to avoid the issues that we now face as a country and the European region faces over the overregulation. Had there been more collection of good outcome data on patients and the outcomes, then maybe there wouldn't be so much scrutiny that there is now around introducing new technologies. And so it all forms a circle. We need these technologies because what's going to replace physicians to do their work when they're not being retrained in the numbers that we need to be retrained to treat a growing population? So, we as an industry need to be better at showing that we care about those quality outcomes in the same way as everything in normal life. People want you to be happy with your purchases. So it's the same thing.
And it's all data driven.
All data driven.
Yeah.
Pick up on that thread. As you will know, doctors are cautious because if every time there was a new technology they picked up, there would be problems. So as a general rule, there are fewer early adopters in medicine. You would rather somebody else try out this new bit of kit than you. But of course, with a registry, you can provide that reassurance that, don't worry, doctor, all the cases will be tracked and we'll know the outcomes for all patients. So that gives a lot of reassurance to the clinicians you're dealing with.
What this might not be a relevant question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it seems so important to have registry data so that we can actually show the efficacy and how devices actually perform in the real world. What percentage of novel devices that are released into the NHS now have a registry attached to them?
Probably not enough is the answer. I think one day every single thing that any doctor does to every patient will be in a database,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Well, it makes 100% sense, doesn't it? If you have the capacity and the capability to do it, why would you not get the data to be able to continually optimize? It's almost like, it's in a funny way, it's like running a business and having no metrics of how that business is running. Nobody would do that. So it's sort of the same as, launching
And
devices.
I've been lucky enough to work with Professor Sir Bruce Keogh, who was the medical director for the NHS for 10 years. And he was a young heart surgeon when I first met him. And we set up the UK Adult Cardiac Surgery Registry. And he got to the point where he was saying to other surgeons, the operation isn't finished when you put the last stitch in. The operation is finished when you put the data into the database. So it's a new mantra. In the US, they'll say, oh, sorry, data collection should be done by clerks. This side of the pond, I believe, and he believes, it's the responsibility of the clinician to track the outcomes.
So then the limiting factor, so registries are clearly a really great idea, but the limiting factor now to registries is the manpower of actually, because, doctors, we've said already, are so busy in any event. If we had registries for every single new device that came out, it would be prohibitively, it couldn't happen because they wouldn't have the time to complete it. What's happening in registry collection or the implementation of registries now that is going to help this moving forward? Is there anything is it going to be possible?
The good news is there's lots of outputs. So we've now built into registries the capacity to press one button and produce a full appraisal report for a doctor. So bariatric surgeons in the UK no longer have to spend weeks trawling through records to complete a summary of all their work. Literally, they press one button, and within 15 seconds, they get an appraisal document that's 15 pages long that describes all the cases, all the outcomes, and the longitudinal analysis.
What about the input, though? Because that seems to be the block, doesn't it? But from what we're talking about now,
if you get enough carrots and benefits, people will recognize the benefit of the data collection. Otherwise, you're quite right, it's a data cemetery. So you have to produce high-quality output. Then there's a good incentive for collecting the data.
What do you mean by incentives?
Such as this appraisal report. They're not spending 2 weeks, gathering that information.
So you're saying the value to you is that you're going to be able to very quickly find out a summation of this data to make actionable insights for your patients to improve your patients' care.
And the other aspect is registries are generating hundreds and hundreds of high-quality clinical papers that go into the scientific press. And as you know, the currency for a doctor is, how many papers have you written? So this is helping them in that regard too.
And it is, it's not just that, you talk about currency, clinicians in the NHS have to do research, particularly at sort of senior levels. And, they get pension increments on doing, so they want to do research, and merit awards and all these things. So you think about everyone benefits from this. And I'm over the years, we've worked brilliantly together, Peter, and I remember, when I met you and you told me about Sir Bruce Keogh, who's a great guy and did a lot for the NHS, highly credible. But Bruce also said it was technology that was going to save the NHS, and I think
absolutely right.
I think now we've got 7.5 million people on a waiting list, and we're talking about physician deficit. There's not going to be doctors around. Something's going to come in and help to manage these patients' lives and get them diagnosed sooner and treated quicker. And it's technology is going to do it, and everybody in the industry has to up the game. And it's that whole blend of the doctors benefit because they're shown and they're credible. They're doing the research. They care about the outcomes. The hospitals are reassured that they're doing the right procedures. The payers are reassured that they're paying for the right procedures on the right population with the right products. And the industry benefits that they can show others. And a lot of the companies that we've worked with over the past 15 years have been startups that get swallowed up by the big boys, Bostons and Medtronics and Strykers. So it's showing them that not only does this work, but we're showing that everyone's happy, and that can only show that this technology should be used in more markets.
So you've done a huge number of registries to date. what are some really great examples of registries that have been done that you can talk about and the outcomes that they've generated? Because I think these are really powerful when we actually put it into examples.
I think one of the big surprises is bariatric surgery, which a lot of clinicians think is a crazy thing to do, and it must be highly dangerous. Actually, when you look at bariatric surgery through registries, you can see there are huge benefits to the patient and the payer. So if you perform bariatric surgery, diabetes melts away. You spend less on medication for hypertension, dyslipidemias, depression, fewer joint replacements. Patients go back to work and become taxpayers again.
So just to jump in quickly, so this really helps all the health economic arguments as well, ginormously. And you might not have seen half of them because you weren't collecting all that data if you just did a clinical trial, because you might only have been looking at one thing. Oh, that's really interesting.
In this country, you'll see articles about bariatric surgery, and the Daily Mail will say, no, you should be spending money treating my grandmother who's got cancer. If you do bariatric surgery, you can get a patient back to a useful and happy life for the next 30 years. The classic example here is in the UK, with a population of 70 million, we do about 5,000 cases a year paid for by the NHS. If you get a Kuwait population of 4 or 5 million, they're doing 5,000 cases a year. The big surprise is if you then go to France, same population as the UK, they're doing 70,000 bariatric surgery procedures a year. 1 in 100 adult French nationals walking around have had bariatric surgery. Why? Because the Ministry of Health realised there's a huge benefit to the patient population and the payer, because these patients are no longer sedentary, sitting at home, unable to work.
Better and you can actually have more of a productive life.
Exactly.
And you imagine if they have a stroke and they're unable to live independently for 20 years, what the cost to their social care costs
And so
are.
the cost up front absolutely is justified by the savings. Yeah. Interesting. That's a fantastic example. Are there any others? Another one.
Yes, we built a registry for the European Society of Vascular Surgery and collected 100,000 records on aortic aneurysm surgery and carotid bypasses. And the data came from 10 countries. It sadly showed that the UK had the worst mortality rate for elective aortic aneurysm surgery compared to other countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Italy, and others. And the question was why? And if you look at countries like Denmark and Switzerland, they've concentrated vascular surgery into specialist units. So I think there are only like 10 vascular units in the whole of Switzerland. In the UK at that time, any hospital would perform this operation. So there were 150 hospitals.
All doing small numbers.
Some doing small numbers. Yeah. Surgeons going, how did I do it last time? Oh, yes, that's how I did it. So it was a scary thing for the patient, because how does the patient know? Complex procedures.
I was working with the early stages of EVAR back in 1999, and all the doctors wanted to do it because they saw just how, patients were in hospital for such a long time with open aneurysm repairs. And you worked with Bar, didn't you? Were you doing EVAR or were you hernias? But I mean, I think, of course the doctors wanted to do this because it meant that the patient had a better outcome, weren't in ITU, hadn't had big incisions and problems. And so the system needed it.
So the outcome was it led to a complete reconfiguration of services. 50 vascular units were shut down, and those surgeons were concentrated in specialist centres, and the mortality rate halved.
It's amazing, isn't it? We were speaking earlier about the Boston Medical Group, or Boston Consulting Group, because they did a very similar study years and years ago about this, and looking at specialization and the number of procedures done in a hospital. There's always a cutoff of if that number of procedures went below a certain number, then complications rocketed up. So it's interesting to see it in the different areas as well.
And that's been shown to be definitely true in heart surgery. You need to do the volumes to get the good outcomes.
You also spoke before about a thyroid registry that changed practice.
There are something like 150,000 thyroid procedures now on a Dendrite registry. And one of the complications or potential complication of the surgery is a recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, which leads to a hoarse voice and so on. And the only way to know whether this has happened is to do a post-operative laryngoscopy. But logically, you should do a pre-operative laryngoscopy as well to check. When we looked at the initial data, only 10% of surgeons were doing both a pre and a post laryngoscopy check. And we built this into a dashboard so you could see your rate versus the rest of the country. And over a 6-year period, people started to realize, hey, I'm not following best practice. I'm in this dot in the bottom left-hand corner. Everyone else is migrating to best practice over here.
Everybody started migrating to the group of dots.
It was a classic example of nudge theory. And within a 6-year period, everybody was doing pre and post, and then using nerve stimulators so they knew exactly where the nerve was. So again, transformed outcomes.
It's it's education, actually, isn't it? It's a form of education.
The one that I remember Peter for, and I worked extensively in the benign prostatic hyperplasia world, and there's been so many great technologies coming along that's replaced transurethral resection. But a number of years ago, NICE introduced embolization, the prostate, and this is another fairly typical example. NICE have got to be fairly cautious about new treatments. They've had their sort of fingers burnt a bit with the introduction of other things that have gone wrong. Not many, but some things have. But with prostate embolization, interventional procedures part of NICE, which is the part of NICE that looks at new treatments to make sure they're safe and effective. Nothing to do with cost. It's about, is it safe? Does it work? It's a bit like when that company up in Newbury tests new cars and puts them into walls. Do the airbags work? Is it a car? Does it stop and start? That's interventional procedures at NICE. And more recently, they've become more cautious because of certain products going wrong. We talked about earlier, meshes and vaginal meshes and bits and bobs. And so they gave that particular treatment research-only recommendation, which meant that the companies, I guess there were several of them, I wasn't involved in that one, but weren't able to sell their product because the payers wouldn't pay for research. So they had to quickly turn that story around to show that this new way of treating prostates, benign prostatic hyperplasia, was safe and it worked. And so Peter set up the registry. And did you do the proms on that?
This was actually funded by NICE.
Yeah.
So it was a 5-way collaboration. So NICE provided funding along with the British Association of Urological Surgeons, who were doing the standard surgery, the British Society of Interventional Radiologists, who were doing the prostate artery embolization, a third-party data analytical group called CEDA based in Cardiff, and we were the provider of the database system. And as Mike said, it showed that there was equivalent efficacy of using prostate artery embolization versus standard surgery, which of course has its own complications. And that reached the BBC News that yes, this is an approved by NICE procedure. So suddenly,
well, they changed the decision, didn't they? Very quickly. I mean, that's the thing. When you get a disappointment like that as a company, you've got obviously doctors that want to use it, but they're not going to get paid for. So the quicker you can turn that decision around and get NICE to change their mind. And I remember being on a call with NICE, and they said that that Dendrite was one of the very few companies, if one of two companies, that they would use to do the registries because they were done in a NICE compliant way, independent. Obviously, with the it's not easy doing registries. So you talk about GDPR and regulatory and all that stuff, but that enabled that treatment to get to patients faster because it was then signed off as standard arrangements by NICE. I think it was standard, and now that treatment was used, I don't know whether it is now because there's been so many new things coming since, but that's just medical technologies, isn't it? But there's a great example of how that changed decisions.
I've got a question about that, and this may be an obvious question, but I'm going to ask. So if NICE said research only, how did the company then get funding through NICE and other organisations in order to fund the registry? Because
this was funded by NICE, this registry.
Oh.
That's quite rare.
Yeah, I just don't understand the mechanism behind that. So I was actually interested for other companies who've maybe gone through NICE, got research only, like what's the mechanism for that to then happen?
I don't know about nowadays, to be honest, but back then, I mean, we worked with Chris Pomfret, who was head of research commissioning, and there was money available back then. But this is about...
So they must have seen a real benefit to this device.
Well,
like
absolutely.
It had real potential. It just didn't have the data to support it yet, so it was worth putting the budget into it. So I suppose that's the differentiator, isn't it? this device really had an awful lot of promise. It just didn't quite have the data ready to get approval yet, but they were willing to put funds in because they believed it was going to get there.
Yeah, because ultimately, you look at it's a very common procedure, and you had a typical back then length of stay of 2.4 days, and an extended operating theatre time, and then some pretty disappointing outcomes for the patients and side effects. So the beauty of something like that is being able to quickly, you're answering so many questions.
I mean, a good example of this is we've had another commission from the European Society of Vascular Surgery to set up a venous stent registry. Deep venous stenting was quite popular in the US and has just arrived in Europe. But the surgeons are unsure. Is this a good thing to do? What's the best indication? Which kind of patients are going to get the best outcome? So we set up a registry that's going to run across the whole of Europe for the next 5 years to answer that question, because the clinical trials don't give them the answers.
And then they can understand where they go. So if people are listening to this podcast now and say, I think we need to get our device into a registry, what's the best pathway? Because you say it's not best for the companies to start their own registries, because whether they're believable or not, the perception is they're not as believable. What is the best pathway if somebody thinks, yes, we really need to start a registry?
Well, the best pathway, of course, is to come and talk to Mike, who understands
I know.
this.
You run Dendrite.
Me, I can explain how it's done.
I've just seen the benefits.
I have grey hair for a good reason. I've learned
and I've got no hair for no.
I learned the hard way. Yes,
exactly.
No, but in truth, there are right ways to set up registries, and there are wrong ways.
When should they start? So when you talk about marketing, or you talk about market access, or you talk about PR, any of those things, or market research, really the earlier you start thinking about these things, the better. And it tends to be, years out from when you're about to launch the product, because you need to think about all the different stages, and how each of these disciplines affects that. If you're looking to do a registry, at what stage should companies start talking or thinking about a registry?
I would start it really early. While you're doing your first clinical trials to look at efficacy, start the registry at the same time. That way you can capture data on all the patients that are undergoing this procedure, not just the ones that are in the clinical trial. And so we're working with a couple of companies who are in this situation. They're startups, but they've realized that observational data captured right at the beginning is going to help them down the road.
So you're almost saying, so obviously you have your clinical development plan of these are the claims we want to have, this is where we want to take our data. But you're almost saying, no, start a registry. So even when you start your first inpatient trials, they're the first people in your registry. And then you capture everybody from that point onwards. So they might not all be in your clinical trials, but they should all be in your registry, because then you have huge power in data as you move forward with the company.
Exactly, especially as you're bringing a new technology to the market, and the clinicians you're dealing with are saying, well, show me the data.
Yeah.
And if you can say, I've got it from the first case, that's incredibly powerful.
Very powerful, from just a trust perspective as well,
Exactly.
on how everything works.
I mean, I'd go back a stage. I know we did the podcast a few weeks ago with John, but it's about, the first journey, such an important part of market access is about understanding the value drivers. And you can only do that by doing early economic modeling to sort of understand how well a technology would have to work in a certain population to benefit them. And so you get that balance of benefits for patients, providers and payers, and you optimize your selling price. And that's always the first part. But the beauty of the registry is that it does capture that patient outcome data quickly and digitally, but make sure that these companies are on the right journey with their technology. So yeah, that's my view. It all needs to blend together.
What are the biggest shortfalls, or what are the biggest, so when somebody says, right, I want to start a registry, what are the biggest issues you see with people starting registry? And what I'm asking here is, obviously when somebody starts a registry, they want to get outcomes, so a great example earlier, when you suddenly realize actually bariatric surgery delivers all these fantastic outcomes that really drives the health economics of the device and justifies it beyond anything. Like, what are the biggest issues you see when somebody thinks about starting a registry that they should watch out for before they do?
I think the most important thing is to get the objectives right. Of what are you trying to, what's the big question you're trying to answer? And the best way to do this is a full Delphi study. So you're asking,
what's the Delphi study?
So it's a way of collecting the questions you need to ask for a registry by asking different stakeholders. So you involve the patient. What's important to the patient? What's important to the doctor? What's important to the payer? What's important maybe to the insurer, and so on and so on. And you have a meeting of all the key stakeholders and ask those questions at the same time.
And so if you don't understand that, so if that work's not done up front, that's probably the biggest issue you see with registries, because then your questions aren't correctly formatted.
Correct.
Which means you don't get the
Because
outcomes
what
you
might
want.
be important to the surgeon is not necessarily what's important to the patient.
It's really interesting because we talk about this all the time in marketing, and it's understanding your stakeholders and the problem you're solving for those stakeholders. And it actually, again, it comes up in all the podcasts that we've done. It's all about really mapping out those stakeholders. And it's not what you think, the value you think you're providing. It's actually asking them, what is
And in fact,
important
I
to
would
you.
start with the patient, because if you get it right for the patient, you're going to get it right for everybody.
That's why we're doing it. Otherwise, we just carry on doing what we already do.
Dendrite Medical Systems has been, how many years old is it now?
30 years now, and as I say, 200 registries. So we have all the templates you could ask, all the documentation, all ready to go, which can then be adapted. Starting from a blank sheet of paper is really hard.
So here's a question. So I'm sure there are other registry companies as well, same as there are other marketing agencies. If you ask me about marketing agencies, I'd say, all marketing agencies have different specialities, and that's very true. And it's about understanding what you want to achieve out of your project and which marketing agency is best to fit that. How would you say Dendrite compares, or what's your specialist area compared to other registry companies?
Well, we've become a very solid, trusted partner, partly because we work with so many different specialties and specialist societies. So we're a very trusted organization. And because we cross so many specialties, we're able to bring ideas for a registry from one registry to another. We've done this repeatedly. So we're not learning on the hoof. We've got a huge amount of experience.
You're probably one of the original registry companies, thinking back about
Probably
when
yes.
you were talking to Bruce Keogh back in the day, and I remember when you met him. And
I don't know of another company that's built more registries, put it that way.
So which areas do you build registries for? Is it just medtech?
We build registries for all sorts of different groups. So we started off building them for specialist medical and surgical societies. We then progressed to big medical academic institutions, then ministries of health, governments, for big pharma, small pharma, big medtech, small medtech, and so on.
And it's in that direction. That's the lovely thing about it, is it didn't start with you working with medical device companies and doing it in that way. You started with the clinical, with your background.
That's right.
To understand what the provider payer wanted, and then you've learned through that to sort of bring it down to where the commercial world, which is a great experience. It's highly credible.
I'm very lucky. I've got several doctors in my team, so we're able to engage at high level, and because we've done so many of these, we know how to do it. We've seen too many mistakes in this world. For example, we set up a national head and neck cancer registry. The NHS IT people had been running it for 10 years. They said, could we produce one of our glossy national database reports using their historical data? We said, sure. They gave us the data. We soon discovered that a patient could be in the registry twice, but not linked, which meant that one patient could die once or twice or 3 times, or be alive more than once, which means that the government couldn't even count the mortality rate. And that's why I think fundamentally we come bottom of the league tables, because because they didn't structure it correctly.
It's interesting, isn't it? And you don't always, you think about registries, and I don't think I have understood the complexity actually into what goes into making a really effective registry. And as soon as you start talking through it, it's like, of course you need to fully map everything out. Of course you need all this hierarchy, the languages, HIPAA compliance, all these different things. You can understand why a registry would cost what it does to set up, because of all of that thought process and time that goes into doing that.
But I think in this country, of course, you've got a single healthcare system, so it's a great place to do that research, to collect that data, because we've got one sort of healthcare system. But the other thing I was going to mention, this is all real world data and real world evidence, which so I mean, real world evidence is what NICE and other payers are looking for. And I remember, we worked with, Chris Pomfret, who worked at NICE he was there for 11 years and worked with us until he retired a couple of years ago. Great guy, Chris. But I remember him mentioning that, and going back to research itself, that the randomized control trial didn't increase the likelihood of NICE selecting you.
I was amazed when you told me that.
Yeah, so there's all this, when medtech start talking to KOLs, of course they want to do RCTs because, it's highly credible and they're big and expensive and the hospitals earn money out of them and doctors get their pension increments and,
But just to jump in from a marketing perspective, in certain countries you really need RCTs.
You do.
So they
you
are
do.
very highly thought of when it comes to marketing materials in certain geographies.
But most countries want to make sure that are these things safe and are they working and are patients happy? That's what we're all trying to do here. And that's why I'm a big fan of EPROMs, the system Peter runs, in the ability for patients not only to collect, that data on a long-term basis, but also there's the capabilities of them to hit a button if they've got a problem, isn't there, within
Also
their
to track
systems.
readmissions, because
readmissions.
sometimes patients won't go back to the clinician that did the first operation because they didn't get on with them or, whatever it is. They'll go to another hospital. And that information is lost.
Can you talk about the EPROMs? That's a new term you've just brought up.
A PROM is a patient-reported outcome measure, and there are a number of validated PROMs. In other words, if you answer the questions and you get a series of answers out, you can be sure that it's giving you a true answer. In other words, it's things like there's this thing called EQ5D, which is a simple questionnaire, but we have to be certified by Euroqual so that the way the questions appear on the screen don't present any bias. So the classic would be, did it go well for you? If you have a big yes and a tiny no, you can see the problem.
Yes.
So you have to make sure that these are truly validated PROMs. Now, not every disease or condition or device has a validated PROM, and they're being created all the time. We currently have a library of about
But when you say
120 of these.
validated PROM, it is something like the EQ5D.
Exactly.
Something like that. So it's a certified questionnaire.
What does EQ5D stand for?
It's a quality of life questionnaire with just 5 questions.
It's used for pain management.
It's a general quality of life.
If I asked you to have one sort of thing that you think marketers should know about registries that they don't know at the moment, what would be that one thing? Actually, Mike, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I was going to ask Peter what registry he's most proud of, what's made the biggest difference. But
I would say they're easier to do than you might expect, and they cost less than you might imagine. And the outputs can be incredibly powerful and will drive commissioners' decision-making more so than clinical trial data will.
I think that's a fantastic summary.
And I'd say speed of doing it. If you've been doing it for 30 years, like Dendrite and Peter, then an expectation that it will get done, that the relationships there with the societies, that the ability to make them global in multiple countries. No, I think it's far more powerful, and there is a whole move towards real world data. We talk about it, and this is purely it. And I keep saying the PROMs is the important part. Is about collecting that long term stuff, because people get treated and they clear off, and you don't hear how they get on. They may be seen 6 months, 12 months later. They have a 10-minute consultation with a doctor.
I think it's actually following the patients as well. Even if they go to another hospital, you're now following them throughout, which is really powerful.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So we set up a registry recently for the Belgian Society of Nephrology, and this is to track patients with long-term renal failure. And of course, they may start off with peritoneal dialysis and progress to hemodialysis. Then they'll disappear off to a university hospital to have their transplant, then come back for follow-up and maybe further dialysis, and then maybe another transplant. So this system follows the patient through that whole pathway.
It's a great example, isn't it? Which a clinical study doesn't, because it's just capturing something in a certain period of time.
Well, thank you very much for attending this episode. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time.